At Easter dinner, my parents excitedly announced they were taking the whole family to Paris for my sister's wedding in June. The room filled with cheers. I then asked what date the wedding was. With a smirk, my mother replied that I was not invited, telling me to stay home and watch my sick son, so I would not embarrass them in front of high society. The room fell silent. I just smiled and dropped the bombshell. My name is Caroline. I am 33 years old and a single mother to a wonderful 7-year-old boy named Leo, who battles severe asthma and a rare heart condition. To my family, I am the ultimate disappointment. They think I am a struggling freelance accountant who barely scrapes by working in pajamas from a cramped apartment. They have absolutely no idea that I am actually the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, a venture capital firm on Wall Street, managing hundreds of millions of dollars. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members who underestimated your worth. The setting for our holiday gathering was the exclusive Oakwood Country Club in Long Island. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the long mahogany table where 20 of our extended family members sat enjoying roasted lamb and expensive wine. I had just handed the head waiter my exclusive black card to cover the entire $6,000 dinner bill. I did this quietly, asking the manager to keep the transaction discreet, simply because I was tired of hearing my parents complain about credit card limits. I wanted a peaceful holiday for once. My mother, Patricia, stood up and tapped her champagne flute with a silver spoon. She wore a designer dress she could not actually afford and beamed brightly at the table. "Attention, everyone," she announced, her voice echoing in the private dining room. "Richard and I have the most wonderful news. We are taking the entire immediate family flying first class to Paris this June for Madison and Desmond's wedding." The table erupted into applause. Madison, my 29-year-old sister, and the undisputed golden child of our family, held up her hand to show off a massive diamond engagement ring. Sitting next to her was her fiancé, Desmond. He was a striking, charismatic African-American man who dressed in custom Italian suits and constantly bragged about being the chief executive officer of a billion-dollar tech startup. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on, treating him like royalty, simply because he projected an image of limitless wealth. I took a sip of my sparkling water and looked at my mother with a polite smile. "That sounds lovely, Mom. What dates are we flying out? I need to arrange Leo's medical schedule with his private doctors before we travel." The smile vanished from my mother's face instantly. She looked at me as if I had just tracked mud onto a pristine white carpet. She let out a short, condescending laugh that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Oh, Caroline, do not be ridiculous. You are not invited." The lively chatter around the large table ground to a dead halt. Aunts, uncles, and cousins stared in uncomfortable silence, their eyes darting between me and my mother. I set my glass down slowly, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "Excuse me." My mother crossed her arms, her tone dripping with venom. "Paris is for high society, Caroline. Desmond has invited his wealthy business partners and highly successful investors to the ceremony. We cannot have a struggling, frumpy single mother hanging around and ruining the aesthetic. Plus, Leo is always coughing or needing some sort of medical treatment. You would just be a massive burden on our trip. Stay home in your little apartment and watch your sick son. Do not embarrass us." I turned my gaze to my father, Richard, expecting at least a shred of parental defense. Instead, he wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and scowled at me. "Listen to your mother, Caroline. Do not start with your usual dramatic victim routine tonight. Madison is marrying a highly successful tech executive. You sit at a computer balancing spreadsheets for pennies. You have been a financial drain and a source of shame for this family since you got pregnant at 26. You should be immensely grateful we even allowed you to sit at this table tonight." The sheer audacity of his statement was almost comical. "Grateful?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "Dad, I just paid the $6,000 bill for this entire dinner. My father slammed his fist on the table, making the expensive crystal glasses rattle. Stop lying to make yourself look important. We all know you only survive because of that government assistance program you managed to scam your way into. You are a freeloader, Caroline. You contribute absolutely nothing to this family's legacy. Madison leaned forward, a vicious smirk playing on her lips. Exactly. Desmond's company is preparing to go public. He is currently reviewing term sheets from massive venture capital firms in New York. We cannot have my embarrassing broke sister begging his rich friends for a handout at our wedding reception. I did not cry. I did not scream. Years of dominating ruthless boardrooms on Wall Street had taught me that anger is a useless emotion when you hold all the leverage. I simply leaned back in my leather chair and smiled. The so-called government assistance program my father was referring to was a massive joke. 5 years ago, when my parents were drowning in debt and facing absolute bankruptcy, I secretly set up a shell corporation. Through that corporation, I had been wiring them $8,000 on the first of every single month to keep a roof over their heads. Their arrogant status-obsessed minds somehow convinced themselves it was a special state grant for distinguished citizens. They were too foolish to realize the government does not just hand out $8,000 a month to people living in luxury suburbs. I calmly reached into my designer handbag, which they had always mocked as a cheap counterfeit, and pulled out my phone. I opened my highly encrypted private banking portal and navigated to the recurring transfers page. There it was, $8,000 scheduled for the first of the month. Without a second hesitation, I hit the cancel button and permanently deleted the transfer mandate. Then I reached back into my bag and pulled out the physical bank statement I had brought with me to review earlier that day. I tossed the thick, glossy paper directly onto my father's plate. It landed with a soft thud, splashing a drop of red wine onto his expensive tie. "That is your reality check, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the silent room like a knife. "That so-called government grant you have been living off of for the past 5 years, it came directly from my personal checking account. But do not worry about the Paris trip. You are going to need every penny you can scrape together from now on, because as of 5 seconds ago, I just cut off your allowance." My father stared at the bank statement resting on his plate. The crisp white paper soaked up the spilled red wine, but the numbers printed in bold black ink were impossible to ignore. $8,000 transferred every single month. Originating account Caroline. Destination account Richard and Patricia. The color drained completely from his face before a violent shade of crimson rushed back into his cheeks. His narcissistic ego simply could not process the reality that his survival depended entirely on the daughter he despised. He slammed his fist onto the table again, this time with enough force to shatter his crystal wine glass. The sharp crack echoed through the dining room. "Get out of my house," he roared, pointing a trembling finger toward the grand oak double doors. "You are a pathological liar. You forged these documents because you are insanely jealous of Madison. You think you can walk into my property, eat my food, and insult my family with this fabricated garbage. Pack your things and get out of my house immediately." My mother gasped, clutching her pearl necklace as if I had physically attacked her. She pointed at me, her face contorted with rage. "You are deeply unwell, Caroline. Your father works incredibly hard to maintain this lifestyle. How dare you try to take credit for the government grant he rightfully secured? You are ruining our Easter dinner just to steal attention from your sister. Get out of our house before we call the police for trespassing." Madison crossed her arms and rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, mocking laugh. "Seriously, Caroline, you need intense psychiatric help. You are a broke freelance accountant. You probably printed that fake bank statement at the local public library. Now leave my engagement party before you embarrass yourself any further. This house belongs to our parents, and you are no longer welcome here." I remained perfectly still in my chair. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch at their screaming. I reached back into my designer handbag and pulled out a thick, heavy legal binder. I tossed it onto the center of the table. It landed right next to the ruined bank statement. The cover of the binder displayed the sleek gold embossed logo of Titan LLC, a real estate holding firm. "This is not your house, Dad," I said, my voice steady and cold. "It has not been your house for 5 years." The entire room fell dead silent. My uncles and aunts exchanged confused glances. My father glared at the binder, his chest heaving with furious breaths. "Let me refresh your memory," I continued, looking directly into my father's panicked eyes. "5 years ago, you made a series of catastrophic investments in the stock market. You drained your retirement accounts, took out massive secondary mortgages, and completely defaulted on your payments. The bank initiated a full foreclosure on this beautiful suburban estate. You and Mom were exactly 3 days away from having your belongings thrown onto the front lawn by the county sheriff. You were entirely bankrupt." My mother let out a strangled gasp. She looked at my father, her eyes wide with terror, silently begging him to deny it. He could not. "But a miracle happened," I said, maintaining absolute eye contact with him. "A private real estate firm called Titan LLC swooped in and bought the debt from the bank in a quiet all-cash transaction. They allowed you to stay in the property. They paid the property taxes. They covered the major maintenance repairs. They essentially let you live here rent-free while you paraded around the country club, pretending you were still a wealthy, successful businessman." My father swallowed hard, a bead of sweat rolling down his forehead. "Titan LLC is a corporate landlord." He stammered, his voice suddenly lacking all its previous authority. "You have absolutely nothing to do with that company. You are just spouting nonsense you found on public property records." I smiled, leaning forward and tapping the heavy binder. "Open it, Richard." His hands shook as he reached out and flipped open the heavy cover. The first page was the official Articles of Incorporation filed with the state of New York. The second page was the property deed. The third page was the operating agreement. "I am the sole managing member and 100% shareholder of Titan LLC." I stated clearly, letting the reality crush his massive ego. "I created that shell company specifically to buy your debt so my nephew would not have to watch his grandparents become homeless. I own the roof over your head. I own the driveway you parked your leased luxury cars in. And considering you just told the actual owner of this property to get out, I am officially giving you a 30-day notice of eviction. I plan to sell the estate next month. You better start packing." My mother collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with her hands as she began to sob uncontrollably. The illusion of her high society life was entirely shattered. My father sat paralyzed, staring at my signature on the legal documents, realizing he was entirely at my mercy. He had absolutely nothing. The suffocating silence was abruptly broken by the sound of slow, mocking applause. Desmond, my sister's fiancé, stepped forward from the shadows of the dining room. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive tailored suit and looked down at me with an expression of pure, arrogant disdain. "That is a cute little power trip," Caroline Desmond sneered, shaking his head. "You bought a suburban house and you think you are some Wall Street tycoon. It is pathetic. You are just a bitter, lonely woman trying to ruin my future wife's special day because you are miserable." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek, black leather checkbook. He clicked a gold pen and quickly scribbled a number on the paper. He ripped the check from the binding and threw it aggressively at my face. The paper fluttered through the air and landed right on top of the eviction notice. "There is $100,000, Desmond said, his voice echoing with arrogant pride. "Take that pocket change, pay off whatever miserable debt you have, and get the hell out of my sight. Madison and I are flying to Paris to plan a $1 million wedding. I make more money in a week than your little real estate stunt is worth. Do not ever disrespect my future in-laws again." My mother immediately perked up, looking at Desmond as if he were a savior sent from heaven. Madison smirked, wrapping her arms around Desmond's waist and glaring at me victoriously. I did not get angry at his blatant disrespect. I slowly reached out and picked up the check. It was indeed written for $100,000. But the amount did not matter to me. What caught my absolute undivided attention was the corporate logo printed in the top left corner of the check. A stylized geometric hexagon next to the name Nexus Tech Solutions. I stared at the logo, a genuine, terrifying smile spreading across my face. Nexus Tech Solutions was not a billion-dollar startup. It was a garbage fraudulent company currently under a massive unannounced investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for running a Ponzi scheme. And I knew this for an absolute fact because the chief executive officer of Nexus Tech Solutions had sent a desperate groveling email to the private inbox of Apex Holdings just this morning begging my venture capital firm for a $5 million bailout to avoid federal prison. Desmond had absolutely no idea that the woman he just threw a check at was the sole deciding vote on whether he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The morning after the disastrous Easter dinner began with the quiet hum of medical equipment. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Manhattan penthouse, casting a warm glow over the hardwood floors. I stood in the doorway of my 7-year-old son's bedroom, holding a cup of black coffee. Leo was still asleep, his small chest rising and falling in rhythm with the oxygen concentrator beside his bed. Next month, he was scheduled for his third open heart surgery, a complex procedure to repair a congenital defect that had haunted him since birth. Seeing him so fragile yet so resilient fortified the armor I had built around myself. My family had called him a burden the night before. They had told me to stay home and hide him away, so we would not ruin their high society illusion. I took a deep breath, letting the cold reality of their cruelty settle into my bones. I walked down the hallway to my private home office, a sleek, soundproof space equipped with multiple trading monitors and secure servers. As the chief executive officer of a massive venture capital firm, I started every morning by reviewing global markets and personal portfolios. But today, my first priority was the irrevocable medical trust I had established solely for Leo. I sat in my leather chair and logged into the highly encrypted banking portal. The trust was heavily funded, meant to guarantee that my son would have immediate access to the world's elite pediatric cardiologists without ever worrying about insurance approvals or hospital billing limits. I clicked on the dashboard, expecting to see the solid 7-figure balance I meticulously maintained. Instead, the numbers on the screen made my blood turn to ice. There was a massive glaring deficit. My hands flew across the keyboard, pulling up the detailed transaction logs. My mind raced through a dozen logical explanations. A banking error, a delayed clearinghouse settlement, an unauthorized sweep from a secondary account. But the truth staring back at me from the high-definition monitor was far more sinister than a simple glitch. A wire transfer had been initiated and cleared just 3 business days ago. The amount was exactly $150,000. I clicked on the routing details and traced the international SWIFT code. The destination account belonged to the estate management group of a 17th-century luxury castle located just outside of Paris. The memo line attached to the transfer read "Initial deposit for the wedding celebration of Madison and Desmond." The air in the room suddenly felt entirely too thin. My own mother had stolen from her dying grandson. She had actively drained a fund meant to keep a 7-year-old boy alive, just so her golden child could secure a fairy tale venue for a fake billionaire. I dug deeper into the audit trail, requesting the digital authorization forms from the bank. When the documents populated on my screen, the sheer audacity of the crime left me breathless. Years ago, before I fully understood the depths of my parents' toxicity, I had listed my mother Patricia as a contingent emergency contact on a legacy account connected to the trust. It was an ancient failsafe designed solely for the event that I was incapacitated, and Leo needed emergency surgical intervention. Patricia had weaponized that loophole. She had physically walked into a private banking branch, presented herself as a distressed grandmother, and submitted a fraudulent emergency claim. And right there on the bottom of the wire transfer authorization form was my signature masterfully forged by the woman who gave birth to me. They did not just exclude me from a wedding. They did not just humiliate me at a country club dinner. They had literally reached into my sick child's life support line and ripped it out to pay for champagne and floral arrangements. The grief and disbelief I felt evaporated in an instant, replaced by a terrifying, absolute rage. The gloves were not just off, they were incinerated. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my senior wealth manager. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the lethal precision of a predator locking onto its prey. I instructed him to instantly freeze the medical trust and flag the $150,000 transfer as a fraudulent transaction involving grand larceny and identity theft. But I was not going to stop there. For 5 years, Richard and Patricia had been living large on platinum credit cards that I had quietly linked to my corporate umbrella accounts, keeping them out of bankruptcy and allowing them to play pretend at their country club. I told the banker to terminate every single card bearing their names. I shut down the gas cards, the grocery accounts, the emergency lines of credit, and the travel rewards. I severed their financial lifelines with a single ruthless command. If they tried to buy a single cup of coffee or put gas in their least luxury cars this morning, their plastic would be aggressively declined. They were now entirely cut off from the capital they felt so entitled to. After securing the banking perimeter, I made the most critical phone call of my entire life. I dialed my lead corporate attorney, Harrison. He was a brilliant, calculating legal shark who handled hostile takeovers and aggressive acquisitions for my firm. He answered on the second ring, immediately sensing the shift in my usual demeanor. I kept my eyes fixed on the forged signature displayed on my monitor. I told Harrison I needed him to draft a criminal prosecution file immediately. I explained the situation with zero emotion, detailing how my mother had committed federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and identity theft to steal from a minor's medical trust. I heard Harrison exhale sharply through the receiver. Even a man who dismantled corrupt corporate executives for a living sounded genuinely repulsed by the sheer depravity of her actions. He asked if I wanted him to contact the federal authorities right now so we could have Patricia in handcuffs before lunchtime. I looked out the window at the sprawling Manhattan skyline, calculating my vengeance with absolute clarity. I told him no. A slow, dangerous smile formed on my face. I explained that if we arrested her today, she would play the victim cry to the family and claim it was all a tragic misunderstanding about wedding finances. We were going to let them fly to Paris. We were going to let them invite all their wealthy, aristocratic friends and pretend they were untouchable royalty. I told Harrison to prepare the embezzlement prosecution file and secure the federal arrest warrants, but keep them strictly sealed. The arrest warrant must be executed at the exact right moment, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. We are going to let them climb to the very top of their high society pedestal, and then we are going to kick it out from under them, while the whole world watches. The fallout from freezing their financial lifelines was immediate and vicious. Less than 24 hours after I cut my parents off from their stolen luxury, I was sitting in the living room of my penthouse reviewing quarterly corporate projections. The private intercom of my residence suddenly buzzed. My head of building security informed me that 2 agents from Child Protective Services were waiting in the lobby downstairs. They possessed an emergency inspection warrant and demanded immediate entry. I did not panic, and my heart rate did not even elevate. I knew exactly who had sent them. Richard and Patricia had hit a massive brick wall when their platinum cards declined at their favorite luxury country club that morning. Their retaliation was as predictable as it was pathetic. They wanted to hit me where it hurt the absolute most. They wanted to threaten my custody of Leo, hoping I would break down, surrender, and turn their money back on. I told security to send the agents up the private elevator immediately. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator opened directly into my expansive foyer. 2 stern-looking agents stepped out, gripping their clipboards with authoritarian tension. They were clearly primed to enter a cramped, filthy apartment reeking of neglect. That was the precise narrative my parents had maliciously spun over the phone. Instead, their jaws practically hit the imported Italian marble floor. They stepped into an $8 million Manhattan penthouse, boasting panoramic floor-to-ceiling views of Central Park. The air inside was crisp and flawlessly filtered by a hospital-grade purification system I had installed specifically for Leo's respiratory needs. The agents looked around in absolute bewilderment, taking in the custom modern furniture, the pristine environment, and the sheer magnitude of the wealth surrounding them. I introduced myself calmly and invited them to sit in the formal living room. The lead agent, a tall woman with sharp, observant eyes, cleared her throat, trying to regain her professional composure. She explained that the state had received a highly distressing anonymous tip. The caller claimed I was a financially destitute and unstable mother who was actively starving my 7-year-old son. The report alleged I was denying him critical medical care for his severe heart condition and that Leo was living in squalor. They claimed I was completely unfit to be a parent and that my child was in immediate mortal danger. I listened to their rehearsed speech without interrupting. I did not raise my voice, and I did not act like a terrified victim defending herself. I acted exactly like the chief executive officer I was. I stood up and led them down the wide hallway to Leo's private quarters. I opened the door to reveal a room that rivaled the best pediatric recovery wards in the entire country. Leo was sitting comfortably in his custom adjustable bed, playing a video game on a large screen, while a certified private pediatric nurse checked his oxygen saturation levels. I introduced the agents to the nurse, who immediately stood up and handed them a thick, meticulously organized medical binder. It contained detailed daily health logs, dietary charts planned by a top-tier pediatric nutritionist, and direct contact information for the chief of pediatric cardiology at Mount Sinai Hospital. I told the agents they were completely free to call the chief of cardiology right now. I explained that I retained him on a massive private contract to monitor my son's health around the clock. The agents flipped through the flawless medical records in total silence. Their initial suspicion melted into profound embarrassment and realization. The lead agent closed the heavy binder and handed it back to the nurse with a heavy apologetic sigh. She looked at me and apologized profusely for the aggressive intrusion. She admitted that the report they received painted a picture of absolute poverty and severe criminal neglect. I smiled coldly and offered to play them a voicemail I had saved from my father. I pulled out my phone and played the message Richard had left me just an hour after his credit cards were violently declined at his golf club. In the audio, my father screamed that if I did not restore his financial access and apologize to the family, he would make sure the state took my sick kid away forever. The agents listened to the audio, their expressions hardening with professional fury. They realized they had been weaponized by a greedy family in a petty financial dispute. The lead agent assured me that filing a false child abuse report is a severe criminal offense in the state of New York. She promised that Child Protective Services would immediately forward the case file to the district attorney to penalize Richard for wasting state resources and making fraudulent, malicious allegations. They assured me my file would be permanently closed and noted as a malicious false report. I escorted the agents back to the private elevator, thanking them for their thorough diligence. The moment the elevator doors slid shut, my personal cell phone buzzed. It was my executive assistant calling from the Apex Holdings corporate office. She sounded highly alarmed, but also incredibly confused. She told me that a woman claiming to be my sister was currently screaming at the corporate reception desk over the phone. Madison had apparently gone to a high-end designer bridal boutique in Soho this morning to purchase a custom wedding gown for her Paris wedding. When her credit card was loudly declined in front of the elite boutique staff and other wealthy brides, Madison had absolutely lost her mind. Assuming I was just a mid-level disposable accountant working at some generic firm, Madison had tracked down the corporate number for Apex Holdings. She was currently demanding to be transferred to the head of the Human Resources Department. My assistant explained that Madison was threatening to fabricate horrific lies about my work ethic until I was fired from my job and left destitute. I laughed out loud, the sound echoing in the empty marble foyer. I told my assistant to put Madison on hold for exactly 2 minutes and then route the call directly to my desk in the chairman's suite. My arrogant sister wanted to speak to the boss to get me fired. She was about to get exactly what she asked for. I walked into the sleek glass tower on Wall Street that housed the headquarters of Apex Holdings. The security guards nodded respectfully as I bypassed the main lobby and stepped into my private executive elevator. My corner office spanned the entire top floor, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the financial district. I sat behind my massive custom walnut desk, feeling the cool leather of my chair. My executive assistant buzzed the intercom. She informed me that the enraged woman on line 1 was still screaming obscenities at the reception staff and demanding to speak with the highest-ranking human resources director immediately. I smiled and instructed my assistant to patch the call directly through to my personal line. I pressed the speakerphone button and leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. The line clicked, and the sound of my sister Madison breathing heavily filled my quiet office. She was completely unhinged. I could hear the faint background noise of upscale retail assistants whispering to each other. She was still standing inside the luxury bridal boutique in Soho, completely humiliated after the credit cards I had frozen declined in front of everyone. "Listen to me, you incompetent corporate drone!" Madison shrieked into the phone, assuming she was speaking to some mid-level human resources manager. "I am calling to report one of your miserable employees. Her name is Caroline, and she is a low-level freelance accountant who works from her pathetic apartment. She is a thief. She just stole a massive amount of money from my parents and cut off their bank accounts out of pure jealousy because I am getting married to a billionaire. I demand that you terminate her employment immediately. If you do not fire her by the end of the day, my fiancé will personally buy your entire miserable accounting firm and liquidate it just to put all of you on the street." I sat in silence, letting her unhinged threats hang in the air. Madison was so blinded by her own arrogance that she never once stopped to wonder how a supposedly poor accountant had the power to freeze elite platinum credit cards. She simply wanted to destroy my livelihood, to punish me for cutting off her lavish lifestyle. Her entire reality was built on the delusion that she was superior to me in every conceivable way. "Are you deaf?" Madison screamed, her voice cracking with absolute desperation. "I said I want her fired right now. She is a toxic, disgusting burden to our family, and she deserves to be completely destitute. Tell me you are processing her termination paperwork right this second, or I will make sure you lose your job too." I leaned forward and brought my face closer to the speakerphone. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, lethal authority of a woman who commanded billions of dollars in global assets. "I am afraid I cannot process that termination request, Madison," I said, my tone dripping with icy amusement. The line went dead silent for a fraction of a second as she recognized my voice. Then her confusion morphed back into pure venom. "Caroline," she hissed. "What the hell are you doing answering this phone? Did they transfer me to your pathetic cubicle? Put your manager on the line right now. I am going to make sure you never work in this city again." I let out a slow, dark laugh that echoed across my expansive corner office. "You seem to have a severe misunderstanding of how the corporate hierarchy works in this building, Madison. You did not call a mid-level accounting firm. You called Apex Holdings, and they did not transfer you to a cubicle. My security team routed your psychotic temper tantrum directly to the top floor because you were harassing my reception staff." Madison scoffed loudly, but I could hear the faint tremor of uncertainty in her breath. "Why would they route my call to you? You are just a number cruncher." "Because you demanded to speak to the person in charge," I replied, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "But there is no human resources manager who can fire me, Madison. I am not an employee. I am the founder and the chairman of the board. I own Apex Holdings. I own the building you just called. I manage a venture capital fund worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You are currently threatening to buy out a company that could purchase your entire pathetic existence 1,000 times over before lunch." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was the sound of a narcissistic mind completely short-circuiting. Madison could not comprehend the reality that the sister she had relentlessly bullied, the single mother she had mocked as a poverty-stricken failure, was actually a Wall Street titan. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as the truth slowly began to crush her grand illusion. She realized in real time that she had no power, no money, and absolutely no leverage against me. "You are lying," Madison finally gasped, her voice small and trembling. "You are making this up to scare me. You are just a pathetic accountant. You do not have that kind of money." "If I do not have that kind of money, Madison, how exactly do you think I bought the house you and our parents live in?" I countered, letting the brutal truth sink in. "How do you think I paid for the $6,000 dinner last night? How do you think I shut off every single credit card in your wallet this morning, leaving you to humiliate yourself at a bridal shop? You are nothing but a parasite living off the scraps I allowed you to have. And now the feast is permanently over." Before Madison could even attempt to formulate a response, the heavy oak doors of my office swung open. My executive assistant stepped into the room holding a sleek digital tablet. She knew I was on a call, but the urgency in her eyes indicated that protocol needed to be broken. I kept the speakerphone engaged, ensuring Madison would hear every single word. "Boss," my assistant said, her clear, professional voice projecting perfectly across the room. "I apologize for the interruption, but we have a critical situation escalating in the lobby." "Go ahead," I instructed, keeping my eyes fixed on the glowing green light of the active phone line. "It is regarding Nexus Tech Solutions," my assistant reported, consulting her tablet. "Desmond, the chief executive officer you asked us to monitor, is currently downstairs. He is bypassing his original email request and is practically begging our security team for a direct emergency meeting with you. He is in a state of total panic. He admitted to the reception staff that his company is on the verge of absolute bankruptcy and he needs a $5 million bailout loan by the end of the business day, or he is going to lose everything to the federal investigators." I smiled, staring at the speakerphone. I could hear the sharp, horrified intake of breath from Madison on the other end of the line. The invincible billionaire fiancé she had been bragging about, the man who threw a fake $100,000 check in my face just last night, was currently standing in my lobby begging for his financial life. "Tell security to send him up to the executive conference room," I instructed my assistant, my smile widening into something truly dangerous. "Tell him the chairman is ready to hear his pitch." I leaned back toward the speakerphone. "Did you hear that, Madison?" I whispered. "It looks like your billionaire groom is actually just a desperate beggar standing in my lobby. Enjoy your walk home from Soho." I pressed the button and disconnected the call, cutting off whatever panicked scream was building in her throat. The trap was perfectly set, and the real destruction was about to begin. I remained in my private office, staring intently at the high-definition security monitors mounted on my wall. The live feed displayed the interior of Apex Holdings' primary executive conference room. The space was an intimidating fortress of glass and steel designed specifically to make men like Desmond feel small. And it was working flawlessly. Desmond was pacing the length of the long mahogany table, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his forehead. His custom Italian suit looked rumpled, and the confident, arrogant swagger he had displayed at Easter dinner was completely gone. He was a desperate rat backed into a corner by the Securities and Exchange Commission, and he needed a $5 million lifeline by the end of the day to avoid a federal indictment. I pressed a button on my intercom and instructed Harrison to enter the conference room. I told him to let the man dig his own grave. I watched through the cameras as Harrison strode into the room carrying a sleek leather folder. Harrison was a legal predator who ate corrupt executives for breakfast. He did not smile when he shook Desmond's hand. He simply sat down at the head of the table, opened the folder, and asked Desmond why a supposedly billion-dollar tech startup was begging a venture capital firm for emergency liquidity on a Tuesday afternoon. Desmond immediately launched into a rehearsed charismatic pitch. He smoothed his tie and flashed his trademark bright smile, trying to project the image of a visionary chief executive officer. He claimed Nexus Tech Solutions was on the verge of a massive public offering and just needed a minor bridge loan to cover temporary operational expansion costs. He threw around buzzwords like synergy, cloud integration, and disruptive algorithms. It was absolute garbage. I sat in my office drinking my coffee and laughing silently at his pathetic attempt to mask a massive Ponzi scheme. Harrison cut him off mid-sentence. Harrison did not care about buzzwords. He cared about the glaring inconsistencies in the financial disclosures Desmond had emailed us that morning. Harrison pointed out that Nexus Tech Solutions had zero proprietary intellectual property, massive cash burn rates, and several alarming inquiries from federal regulators. Harrison closed the folder and told Desmond that Apex Holdings did not throw $5 million into burning buildings. He stood up to leave, executing the psychological manipulation perfectly. Panic completely consumed Desmond's face. He physically jumped out of his chair and begged Harrison to sit back down. He insisted the company was solid but admitted he was facing a minor cash flow hiccup before his wedding. Then he played what he genuinely believed was his ultimate trump card. He leaned across the table and began bragging about his wealthy future in-laws. Desmond proudly announced that he was marrying into a high society dynasty. He named my father Richard and my mother Patricia, claiming they were influential real estate moguls who owned sprawling suburban estates and massive generational trust funds. He told Harrison that his bride-to-be Madison was the heir to a massive fortune. He promised that even if his tech company faced a temporary downturn, his new wealthy family had more than enough liquid capital to guarantee any financial obligations. He was literally trying to use the fake wealth I had provided to my toxic family as collateral to scam my own investment firm. The absolute irony was so delicious I could barely contain my amusement. Through the hidden earpiece Harrison wore, I calmly instructed my lawyer to take the bait. I told Harrison to pretend he was highly impressed by the family name and to offer him the capital with our special conditions attached. Harrison sat back down and feigned a look of intrigued respect. He told Desmond that Apex Holdings valued strong elite family connections. He said that if Desmond's future in-laws were as wealthy and powerful as he claimed, the firm would be willing to expedite the $5 million wire transfer by the end of the business day. Desmond let out a massive sigh of relief, a triumphant, arrogant grin returning to his face. He thought he had just outsmarted a Wall Street shark. But then Harrison pulled a secondary document from his leather folder and slid it across the table. It was a custom-drafted emergency lending agreement. Harrison explained that because the loan was highly irregular and expedited, Desmond would have to agree to a few standard security clauses. The terms were a financial death sentence. I had specifically directed Harrison to draft a predatory, merciless contract. The agreement stated that the $5 million was a personal liability loan, not a corporate one. Desmond had to put up every single asset he owned as collateral. Furthermore, the contract contained an airtight criminal liability waiver. It explicitly stated that if Desmond or Nexus Tech Solutions were found guilty of any financial fraud, SEC violations, or embezzlement, Apex Holdings had the immediate unilateral right to seize total control of the company, liquidate his personal assets, and hold him entirely responsible for all legal penalties. Harrison handed Desmond a gold pen and told him that the funds would be released the moment his signature hit the paper. He advised Desmond to have his legal counsel review the terms, but reminded him that the offer expired the second he walked out the door. I watched the security feed closely. Desmond stared at the dense legal jargon. His hand trembled. He knew his company was a total fraud. He knew the SEC was breathing down his neck. He knew signing that document meant betting his freedom on a lie. But he was blinded by his own greed and completely desperate to secure the cash before his lavish Paris wedding. He foolishly believed he could just shift the money around, manipulate the ledgers, and walk away a billionaire before anyone noticed the missing funds. Without reading another word, Desmond gripped the pen and signed his name on the dotted line. He legally handed his entire life, his company, and his freedom directly over to me. Harrison collected the documents, offered a cold handshake, and walked out of the room. I sat in my office staring at the monitor as Desmond celebrated his hollow victory, unaware that he had just signed his own arrest warrant. The trap was perfectly sprung. Now it was time to let them all fly to Paris and watch the real destruction begin. 48 hours after I secured the trap agreement with my future brother-in-law, the heavy hand of the law finally knocked on my parents' front door. The Federal Courier arrived at their suburban estate during their morning coffee, serving Richard and Patricia with official court summons for grand larceny and wire fraud regarding the stolen $150,000. The sheer panic must have been absolute. Instead of calling a defense attorney, they did exactly what narcissists always do when cornered. They drove straight into Manhattan to physically intimidate the victim. They still firmly believed I was just a disposable freelance accountant renting a cheap desk in a corporate high-rise. They marched into the soaring marble lobby of Apex Holdings, fully intending to drag me out by my ear and force me to drop the charges. The ground floor of Apex Holdings is an intimidating fortress of polished granite and biometric security turnstiles. Richard and Patricia bypassed the visitor reception desk and tried to push their way right through the barriers like they owned the place. My head of building security intercepted them immediately. I watched the entire pathetic display unfold on the high-definition surveillance feed from my penthouse office. Richard was red in the face, jabbing his finger at the guard's chest, demanding to be led up to the accounting department. Patricia was clutching her designer handbag, weeping loudly, and creating a massive theatrical scene to garner sympathy from the wealthy hedge fund managers walking past. She wailed to anyone who would listen that her cruel, unstable daughter was trying to destroy their family over a simple financial misunderstanding. They were screaming my name, echoing off the marble walls, demanding that the lowly accountant Caroline be brought down to face her parents. Richard even yelled at the security chief to fetch my manager so he could have me reprimanded for insubordination. I pressed the intercom button on my desk and told security to hold them right there. I did not send a representative. I did not hide behind my corporate shield. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, stepped into my private glass executive elevator, and descended to the main lobby. When the elevator doors slid open, the chaotic screaming instantly ceased. The security guards immediately stepped back and nodded respectfully, parting like the Red Sea to let me through. My parents stared at me in complete bewilderment. They could not comprehend why the heavily armed security team was treating me with absolute reverence. But their confusion lasted only a second before their toxic parental instincts kicked back in. They realized they were losing the audience in the lobby, so they escalated their performance. Patricia lunged forward, grabbing the velvet rope barrier. She unleashed a torrent of emotional manipulation perfectly designed to break my resolve. She sobbed hysterically, asking how I could be so incredibly vicious to my own flesh and blood. She screamed that I was trying to kill this family over a petty grudge. "Do you want to destroy your sister's life?" Patricia wailed, her voice cracking with practiced theatrical grief. "The wedding in Paris will be completely ruined if our accounts stay frozen and we have to go to court. You are a cold-blooded, heartless monster, Caroline. You have always been jealous of Madison, and now you are weaponizing the legal system just to sabotage her happiness." She reached out, trying to grab my hand to force a moment of maternal connection, but I took a deliberate step back. She cried harder, claiming that a good daughter would never drag her own mother into a criminal investigation, and that I was tearing a hole in her heart by acting like a ruthless sociopath. Richard slammed his fist against the security desk, echoing my mother's horrific gaslighting. He demanded that I pick up my phone, call the authorities, and withdraw the criminal complaint immediately. He told me that family always forgives family. He insisted that the money was just a temporary loan for the wedding, and that I was overreacting because of my own miserable, lonely life. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and told me that if I did not fix this mess right now, I would carry the guilt of destroying our family legacy forever. They were trying to make me feel guilty for prosecuting them for stealing the money meant to keep my 7-year-old son alive. It was the ultimate narcissistic delusion. I stood perfectly still, letting their toxic poison wash over me without absorbing a single drop. I did not yell. I did not justify my actions. I did not try to explain that you cannot just borrow money from a pediatric medical trust. I calmly reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a crisp, thick legal document bearing the official seal of the state Supreme Court. I walked right up to the velvet rope and shoved the document directly against my father's chest, forcing him to take it. I looked dead into his panicked eyes. I am not withdrawing anything, I stated, my voice echoing coldly across the silent marble lobby. That paper you are holding is not a warning. It is an expedited eviction order signed by a judge this morning. You and Mother have exactly 24 hours to pack your bags and vacate my property. Richard looked at the eviction notice, his hands trembling violently as the reality of his total ruin finally set in. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The arrogant patriarch was completely broken. The law has absolutely no room for mercy, and neither do I added, turning my back on them. I signaled the guards to formally escort them out of the building. But as Patricia was being physically guided toward the revolving glass doors, she dug her heels into the floor and let out a vicious, desperate shriek. The fake tears vanished instantly, replaced by raw, unhinged malice. "You think you have won, Caroline?" she screamed, her face contorted with pure hatred. "I am going straight to the press. I will call every major newspaper in New York and expose you as a deranged, abusive daughter. I will completely destroy your professional reputation and burn your entire life to the ground." Patricia was not making empty threats in the lobby of my building. Within 48 hours, my public relations team intercepted several inquiries from bottom-tier tabloid journalists who were looking for a statement. Richard and Patricia had marched straight from my corporate headquarters back to the familiar safety of their beloved Oakwood Country Club. Richard planted himself at the mahogany bar in the men's lounge and began spinning a masterful web of absolute fiction. He poured expensive scotch for his elite golf buddies and played the role of the devastated, heartbroken patriarch. He told the prominent real estate developers and retired hedge fund managers that his eldest daughter had completely lost her mind. He claimed I was a ruthless, ungrateful monster who was illegally attempting to evict her own aging parents onto the street out of pure spite. He completely omitted the fact that he was bankrupt and that the house legally belonged to my firm. He definitely forgot to mention the grand larceny regarding my son's medical trust. He painted himself as a successful martyr, being unfairly targeted by a vindictive child. The country club elite ate it up. They promised to use their media connections to expose me and ruin my firm to protect their friend. My corporate communications director rushed into my office, advising me to release a preemptive public statement to kill the tabloid rumors before they gained traction. I shook my head and told her to stand down immediately. I do not play defense, and I do not argue with gossip columns. I fight with capital, and I fight to permanently eradicate the threat. I summoned Harrison to my office and ordered him to pull the financial dossiers on every single man sitting at that country club bar with my father. Apex Holdings had unparalleled access to institutional debt portfolios and global credit networks. It took my legal team exactly 3 hours to map out the financial vulnerabilities of Richard's closest allies. It turns out that the men boasting about their immense wealth at Oakwood Country Club were drowning in massive hidden liabilities. One of Richard's best friends, a prominent luxury car dealership owner, was severely overleveraged on his commercial real estate loans and facing a massive liquidity crisis. Another golf buddy, a local politician, had quietly taken out a predatory high-interest bridge loan to cover his failing restaurant franchise. I instructed Harrison to aggressively buy up all of their outstanding debt through our shadow holding companies. By the end of the business day, Apex Holdings was the sole primary creditor for the 5 loudest men defending my father. I legally owned their financial futures and held the power to push them all into immediate bankruptcy. I did not send lawyers to threaten them. I simply had my wealth management team forward a highly confidential email to each of those specific men. The email contained 2 attachments. The first attachment was a formal legal notice that their commercial debts had been successfully acquired by my firm and were subject to immediate comprehensive audit. The second attachment was a redacted copy of the federal wire fraud indictment file Harrison had drafted. It contained irrefutable banking proof that Richard was entirely bankrupt and had recently forged documents to steal $150,000 from a 7-year-old boy's emergency open-heart surgery fund. I included a brief, polite message stating that Apex Holdings strongly prefers not to do business with individuals who publicly associate with child abusers and convicted thieves. The response was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic for my father. The elite members of the Oakwood Country Club did not care about loyalty or friendship. They cared entirely about their own survival and their own bank accounts. When they realized they were defending a broke criminal and risking their own empires, they turned on Richard with savage, terrifying speed. The following afternoon, Richard walked into the country club expecting to be greeted with sympathetic pats on the back and offers to help him fight his wicked daughter. Instead, he was intercepted at the front gates by the club president and 2 armed security guards. I received the full detailed report from one of my newly acquired debtors, who was eager to prove his absolute loyalty to me. Richard was publicly dragged out of the dining room in front of the entire membership board. His former friends shouted at him, calling him a pathetic fraud and a disgusting thief. They demanded to know how he dared to drink their top-shelf liquor while stealing money from a sick child. The club president formally revoked his membership on the spot, physically cutting his access card in half and banning him from the premises for life. Richard was thrown out onto the pavement, stripped of his fake high society armor, completely humiliated and socially annihilated. The tabloid reporters immediately dropped the smear campaign when they received anonymous tips from those same men about the wire fraud. The media blackout was absolute. While my parents were losing their house, their reputation, and their entire social circle, my sister Madison remained completely detached from reality. She was utterly consumed by the delusion of her impending billionaire wedding. She refused to acknowledge that her parents were currently packing their belongings into garbage bags back in New York. That evening, I sat on my velvet sofa watching Leo play quietly with his toys. My phone buzzed with an alert from Instagram. Madison had just posted a new story to her public profile. The photo showed her holding 2 first-class boarding passes to Paris, perfectly manicured nails resting on a vintage luxury luggage set. She was sitting in the VIP departure lounge at John F. Kennedy International Airport, sipping expensive champagne. The caption beneath her photo was dripping with toxic arrogance. It read, "Leaving all the poor jealous losers behind to go marry my billionaire prince in a French castle. Some people are just born for greatness, while others are destined to stay at home and be miserable. Catch you in Paris, peasants." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. Madison thought she had won. She actually believed she was flying off to a fairy tale life funded by the money they stole from my son. She had absolutely no idea that Desmond was a broke fraud who had just signed his entire existence over to my firm. I locked my phone and stood up, feeling a rush of cold anticipation. I walked over to my desk and pulled out my custom embossed passport. I pressed the intercom button and connected to my private aviation team. I instructed my pilot to fuel the company jet and file a direct flight plan for Charles de Gaulle Airport. The domestic skirmish was officially over. The war was moving to Paris, and I was going to be the guest of honor. 4,000 miles away, my toxic family was completely intoxicating themselves on stolen glory. Madison and Desmond had booked the grandest suites at a luxury hotel in Paris, using the very last drops of liquidity siphoned from Desmond's collapsing corporate scheme and the blood money stolen directly from my 7-year-old son. My private surveillance team informed me that Richard and Patricia had slinked onto an overnight commercial flight right after their humiliating expulsion from the country club. They were now parading around the French capital, acting as if the eviction notices on their suburban mansion did not exist. Madison was flooding her social media feeds with highly filtered photos of rare white truffles, designer dress fittings, and vintage champagne. She posted videos of Desmond tipping Parisian concierges with crisp $100 bills, aggressively maintaining the facade of a self-made tech billionaire. They were blissfully oblivious to the fact that their entire European fantasy was built on a rapidly crumbling foundation of federal wire fraud and imminent international indictments. They genuinely thought they had outrun their consequences by crossing the Atlantic Ocean. They thought wrong. Before I could cross the ocean to deliver their final reckoning, I had to ensure my absolute top priority was completely untouchable. I personally drove Leo to the private pediatric wing of Mount Sinai Hospital for his intensive pre-surgical admission. I did not rely on standard hospital security protocols. I brought in my own elite private security detail comprised of former federal agents to stand guard at the doors of his recovery suite 24 hours a day. I handed the chief of security a strict list of authorized medical personnel. I explicitly ordered that if Richard, Patricia, or Madison somehow attempted to call the hospital or manipulate the staff from overseas, they were to be treated as hostile threats. If any unauthorized person stepped foot on that floor, they were to be arrested for trespassing immediately. I kissed Leo's forehead, promising him that his medical trust was fully secured and replenished, and that Mommy had to take a quick business trip to take out the trash. He smiled and squeezed my hand, completely safe and insulated from the toxic war I was currently waging. With my son heavily guarded, I left the hospital and stepped into the back of my armored SUV. My driver bypassed the chaotic commercial terminals of the international airport and headed straight for the private executive tarmac in Teterboro. The sleek, heavily modified Gulfstream jet, bearing the discreet Apex Holdings logo, was waiting on the runway, its engines already whining with raw power. I did not have to deal with baggage check security lines or the degrading reality of commercial travel that my sister had just bragged about on her social media. I walked up the illuminated stairs and stepped into the flying boardroom that served as my mobile command center. The flight attendant handed me a glass of sparkling water as I took my seat at the polished mahogany conference table in the sky. As the jet lifted off the tarmac, cutting through the clouds and setting a direct course for Europe, I opened my highly encrypted laptop. The transatlantic flight gave me 7 hours of uninterrupted focus to orchestrate the absolute annihilation of Desmond's fraudulent empire. Harrison, my lead corporate attorney, had uploaded the final prosecution dossiers to our secure offshore server. I opened the digital file labeled Nexus Tech Solutions. Desmond had foolishly transferred the last remaining dregs of his company funds to European offshore accounts, hoping to launder the money through his lavish wedding expenses. He violated 3 different federal banking laws the moment that capital crossed international borders. I reviewed the airtight legal trap Harrison had constructed. By signing that emergency loan agreement in my office, Desmond had legally surrendered complete operational control of his company to Apex Holdings. I was now technically his boss, his primary creditor, and his sole executioner. I drafted a direct communication to my high-level contacts at the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington. I attached the unredacted ledgers proving that Desmond had been running a massive financial scheme defrauding hundreds of angel investors to fund his tailored suits and luxury sports cars. Because the stolen funds had now crossed into European jurisdiction, the crime escalated from a domestic financial dispute to a matter of international money laundering. I opened a secondary encrypted channel to the Financial Crimes Division of Interpol. I transmitted the comprehensive audit proving that Desmond was currently spending illicit funds on French soil. I included the exact GPS coordinates of the Château de Villette, where the wedding festivities were taking place tonight. I did not just want him sued in a civil court. I wanted him violently extracted from his own rehearsal dinner by heavily armed European authorities. I typed a short authorization code on my keyboard and pressed send. The files vanished from my outbox, instantly distributed to the highest levels of global law enforcement. There was no undo button. The countdown to their absolute ruin had officially begun. For the remainder of the flight, I rested my eyes, letting the quiet hum of the jet engine soothe my mind. I was not stressed. I was not anxious. I was a corporate surgeon preparing to cut a malignant tumor out of my life forever. The Gulfstream touched down smoothly on the private runway at Paris-Le Bourget Airport, just as the golden hour sun bathed the French capital in a warm, deceptive glow. Before the cabin doors even opened, my secure phone buzzed with an incoming encrypted message from Harrison. The text was incredibly brief, but it carried the heavy weight of a guillotine dropping. It confirmed that the French Economic Police and Interpol had received the dossiers, reviewed the irrefutable evidence of international fraud, and mobilized their tactical financial crimes units. The arrest warrants were fully active and cross-referenced with local Parisian authorities. I stepped off the jet into the crisp European evening air. A custom black Maybach with deeply tinted windows was idling on the tarmac, waiting exclusively for me. My personal protection team opened the heavy reinforced door, and I slid into the luxurious leather interior. The driver looked at me through the rearview mirror, waiting for my command. I adjusted the cuffs of my bespoke designer blazer and looked out at the glittering lights of Paris. "Take me to Château de Villette," I commanded, my voice entirely devoid of mercy. "It is time for the rehearsal dinner." The Maybach tires crunched softly against the pristine gravel of the Château de Villette. The 17th-century French estate was bathed in golden architectural lighting, projecting an illusion of flawless, aristocratic wealth. I sat in the plush leather back seat, observing the opulent rehearsal dinner unfolding through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass terraces. Desmond had spared absolutely no expense using the stolen funds from my son and the drained accounts of his collapsing corporate scheme. The courtyard was overflowing with imported white orchids, crystal champagne towers, and a live classical orchestra. The guest list was a carefully curated collection of arrogant venture capitalists, European socialites, and naive angel investors Desmond had lured here to legitimize his fraudulent tech empire. He was currently standing by the grand fountain, wearing a bespoke velvet tuxedo, holding court with a group of older businessmen. He was laughing loudly, projecting the ultimate image of a triumphant self-made billionaire. My parents, Richard and Patricia, were mingling effortlessly among the French elite, holding their crystal flutes with rehearsed elegance. They were parading around as if they were generational tycoons, entirely suppressing the reality that they were bankrupt frauds facing federal indictment back in New York. And there was Madison. She was draped in a ridiculously extravagant silk gown, acting like a reigning monarch receiving her loyal subjects. She was oblivious to the financial guillotine hovering directly above her neck. I signaled my private security detail. 2 towering former federal agents stepped out of a trailing black SUV and flanked the doors of my Maybach. I stepped out into the crisp Parisian night air. I was not wearing the exhausted, sensible clothes of the struggling freelance accountant my family believed me to be. I was wearing a custom-tailored emerald green haute couture gown that hugged my frame with lethal precision. Around my neck rested a genuine diamond collar that cost more than the entire heavily mortgaged estate my parents had just been evicted from. Every inch of my appearance was calibrated to completely annihilate Madison on her own battlefield. My guards marched ahead of me toward the grand entrance of the main ballroom. The massive oak doors stood 20 feet high, guarded by the chateau's private security. My men simply flashed their international credentials and shoved the doors wide open. The heavy wood groaned loudly, echoing across the cavernous ballroom. The sudden violent noise cut through the polite high society chatter like a gunshot. The string orchestra abruptly stopped playing mid-note. Hundreds of wealthy guests turned their heads simultaneously to see who had dared to interrupt the exclusive gathering. I stepped across the threshold, my diamond heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The collective gasp from the room was palpable. The venture capitalists and investors who had been ignoring Desmond's rambling suddenly stood up straighter, captivated by the sheer, unadulterated power radiating from my entrance. I did not look at them. I locked my eyes directly on my family. The color drained from Richard and Patricia's faces so fast they looked like they had seen a ghost. Richard dropped his champagne glass, letting it shatter against the marble. Patricia gripped the edge of a cocktail table, her mouth hanging open in absolute terror. Desmond froze mid-sentence, his arrogant smile collapsing into an expression of profound confusion. He recognized me as the woman he had thrown a fake check at, but his brain could not compute why the supposedly destitute sister was standing in a French castle dripping in millions of dollars of authentic jewelry. But Madison had the most visceral reaction of all. The golden child experienced a catastrophic psychological collapse in real time. Her eyes bulged as she took in my designer gown and the flawless diamonds catching the light of the chandeliers. I had completely and effortlessly eclipsed her on the single most important night of her fabricated life. Her shock instantly morphed into unhinged feral rage. "What the hell is she doing here?" Madison shrieked, her shrill voice echoing violently across the silent ballroom. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at my face, abandoning every ounce of her fake high society poise. "Security, get her out of here right now. She is a trespassing broke accountant. She is a pathetic freeloader who sneaked in to ruin my wedding. Throw her out into the street." The French security guards hesitated, completely intimidated by my elite protection detail. Madison stomped her foot, her face turning an ugly shade of crimson. "Did you hear me? I said throw that parasite out." Patricia, snapping out of her paralyzed shock, realized that their entire web of lies was about to be exposed to the wealthy investors they were desperately trying to impress. Her desperate need to maintain control overrode her basic common sense. She lunged forward, her face twisted with pure malicious hatred. She raised her hand high into the air, intending to deliver a vicious public slap across my face to put me back in my place. She never even came close. Before Patricia's hand could descend, one of my towering bodyguards stepped forward with blinding speed. He caught her wrist mid-air, gripping it with cold, professional force. He did not hurt her, but he locked her entirely in place, twisting her arm just enough to force her to her knees in front of the entire ballroom. Patricia let out a humiliated gasp, struggling helplessly against the grip of a highly trained operative. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked down at my mother writhing on the marble floor and offered her a slow, ice-cold smile. I stepped gracefully around her pathetic form, ignoring Madison's continued hysterical screaming. I walked straight up the center aisle, commanding the absolute attention of every single billionaire and investor in the room. I ascended the marble steps to the grand stage, approached the terrified master of ceremonies, and smoothly snatched the silver microphone right out of his trembling hand. The microphone felt cool and heavy in my hand. I stood at the center of the elevated stage, looking down at a sea of perfectly tailored suits and glittering evening gowns. The opulent ballroom of the Chateau de Villette was so quiet you could hear the faint rustle of silk and the terrified, ragged breathing of my mother, who was still restrained on the marble floor by my security detail. I tapped the microphone once. The sharp electronic thud echoed off the frescoed ceilings, demanding the absolute attention of every billionaire, aristocrat, and venture capitalist in the room. "Good evening, distinguished guests." I began, my voice smooth and projecting with flawless authority. "For those of you who do not know me, my name is Caroline. I am the older sister of the bride-to-be. I am also the woman my family specifically banned from attending this magnificent celebration. They told their country club friends I was too busy working overseas. They told some of you I was a mentally unstable freelance accountant who would only embarrass them. But the truth is, they simply could not afford to have me here tonight, because my presence ruins their carefully constructed illusion of generational wealth." I looked directly at Madison. She was shaking violently, her extravagant silk gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. Her pristine image was shattering in front of the exact high society elite she had desperately tried to impress. Despite not being invited, I felt it was my duty as the loving older sister to fly across the Atlantic to deliver a wedding gift I announced. A gift that perfectly encapsulates the absolute moral bankruptcy of the people hosting you tonight. I raised my hand and snapped my fingers. The sharp sound was a predetermined signal. From the shadows of the grand arched doorways, 6 members of my private security team stepped forward. They were carrying heavy, sleek black leather portfolios. With terrifying military precision, they fanned out across the grand ballroom. They moved from table to table, placing one thick dossier directly in the center of every single dining arrangement. The wealthy guests exchanged wary, confused glances. The elite tech investors who Desmond had spent the entire evening courting cautiously reached out and opened the dark folders. "I highly recommend you review the contents of my wedding gift," I instructed, leaning slightly into the microphone. "Let us start with the first document on the left. That is an official bank statement and a federal wire transfer authorization form. You might notice the amount is exactly $150,000. That money was not drawn from a vast family fortune. It was stolen. My mother, Patricia, forged my signature just 4 days ago to unlawfully drain that exact amount from an irrevocable medical trust." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The sound of heavy crystal glasses being set down on the tables echoed loudly as the guests realized the severity of my words. "That medical trust belongs to my 7-year-old son, Leo," I continued, my voice dropping to a deadly, chilling register. "My son has a severe congenital heart defect and is scheduled for open heart surgery at the end of this month. Patricia committed federal wire fraud and grand larceny to steal her own grandson's life-saving medical funds. And why did she do it? She did it to pay the deposit for this exact castle. The vintage champagne you are currently drinking, the imported white orchids on your tables, and the very chair my sister is sitting on were all paid for with blood money stolen from a dying child." The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. Several aristocratic women physically recoiled, pushing their champagne flutes away in absolute disgust. The venture capitalists who had been nodding along to Desmond's fake business pitches just minutes ago stared at the banking documents with cold, furious realization. They were sharks themselves, and they instantly recognized the undeniable proof of federal financial crimes. My father, Richard, finally broke his paralyzed silence. He took a pathetic, staggering step toward the stage, waving his hands frantically. "Do not listen to her," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "She is insane. She fabricated those papers to destroy our reputation. We are wealthy investors. We own a massive estate in New York." I smiled warmly at him and pointed to the portfolios. "Turn to the second page of the dossier, Richard. I encourage everyone to look at it." The guests flipped the heavy parchment paper. "What you are looking at now is a legally executed Supreme Court eviction order," I declared, projecting my voice over Richard's pathetic stammering. "My parents do not own a massive estate. They have been entirely bankrupt for 5 years. I secretly purchased their foreclosed home through a corporate holding company to keep them off the street. But yesterday morning, I formally evicted them. They are completely destitute and legally homeless. They flew to Paris on stolen money, hoping to lock down this marriage before anyone realized they did not have a single penny to their names." The ballroom descended into pure chaos. The elegant facade of the rehearsal dinner was completely obliterated. Wealthy investors began standing up, buttoning their suit jackets and muttering angrily to one another. The high society guests looked at my family with unadulterated revulsion. Patricia began to sob hysterically on the floor, thrashing against the unyielding grip of my bodyguard, wailing that her life was ruined. Madison buried her face in her hands, letting out a high-pitched, agonizing scream as her entire fabricated universe collapsed into dust. But Desmond did not cry. His massive narcissistic ego completely violently snapped. The illusion of his billionaire tech empire was being threatened in front of the exact investors he needed to scam. He let out a primal roar of sheer fury. He shoved his way past the fleeing guests, knocking over a crystal floral arrangement. He stormed up the marble steps of the grand stage, his eyes bulging with absolute madness. He lunged at me violently, ripping the heavy silver microphone right out of my hands. My security guards instantly drew their weapons, moving to tackle him, but I held up my hand, ordering them to stand down. I wanted him to speak. I wanted him to dig his grave all the way to the bottom. "You are a lying, jealous bitch," Desmond screamed into the microphone, spittle flying from his lips. His voice echoed like thunder across the chaotic room. "You are just a pathetic, broke accountant trying to ruin my life because you are miserable. You think these papers mean anything. I am a tech billionaire. My company is going public. You cannot touch me. You are nothing." Just this morning, the most powerful venture capital firm in New York, Apex Holdings, wired me $5 million in liquid cash. They backed my company. I have millions in the bank right now. I am untouchable, and I will completely crush you. Desmond clutched the silver microphone so tightly his knuckles turned a grayish white against his dark skin. He paced the center of the grand stage, panting heavily like a cornered animal trying to project dominance. He pointed the microphone at the crowd of wealthy investors who were already edging toward the heavy oak exit doors. He desperately commanded them to stay and ignore the absolute truth I had just dropped on their tables. He puffed out his chest and used his booming, charismatic voice to weave the ultimate delusional lie. He told the aristocratic guests that Apex Holdings was the most ruthless elite venture capital firm on Wall Street, and they had just bet $5 million on his genius. He claimed their top lawyers had vetted his algorithms and cleared his ledgers. He laughed a harsh, manic sound that echoed off the crystal chandeliers and pointed directly at my face. He called me a miserable, jealous bookkeeper who spent her entire pathetic life crunching numbers for pennies while he was building a global tech empire. Madison, hearing her fiancé invoke the name of a massive Wall Street titan, suddenly found a burst of toxic courage. She wiped the smeared mascara from her cheeks and pulled herself up from the marble floor. She marched to the edge of the stage, lifting her chin with that signature arrogant superiority she had weaponized against me since childhood. She glared at me with absolute contempt and shouted for the entire ballroom to hear. She told the remaining European socialites that I was nothing but a cheap, bitter accountant who lived in a miserable, cramped apartment. She spun a hysterical narrative claiming I was a failed single mother who was completely obsessed with ruining her fairy tale wedding out of pure, unadulterated spite. She bragged that her future husband was a certified tech billionaire backed by the most powerful financial titans in New York, and that my little stack of printed papers meant absolutely nothing against his unlimited capital. She demanded that the chateau security guards throw me out into the Parisian streets where a pathetic loser like me belonged. I stood perfectly still under the blazing stage lights. I listened to their desperate, unhinged screaming. I looked at their sweat-drenched faces and their panicked, bulging eyes. And then I did the one thing they never expected. I threw my head back and let out a genuine, ringing laugh. It was not a nervous chuckle. It was a rich, echoing laugh of pure, unfiltered amusement. The sound cut through the tense atmosphere of the ballroom like a polished diamond blade. My complete lack of fear instantly silenced Madison. Her toxic bravado evaporated as she realized my laughter was not a defense mechanism. It was the sound of a predator watching its prey willingly step onto a landmine. I stopped laughing and took slow, deliberate steps toward Desmond. He instinctively took a step back, his tall, athletic frame trembling as I closed the distance. I did not fight him for the microphone. I simply extended my hand and waited. The sheer, authoritative weight of my presence forced him to surrender it. He handed the microphone back to me, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. I placed the microphone near my lips and looked out at the silent, terrified crowd. Then I reached into my custom emerald handbag. I did not pull out another printed bank statement. I pulled out a thick, crisp legal document bound in heavy black leather. It was not a copy. It was the original master contract stamped with the official gold seal of the state of New York. I held it up for the entire ballroom to see. Desmond, I said, my voice radiating a calm, lethal finality. You are absolutely right about one thing. Apex Holdings is indeed the most ruthless elite venture capital firm on Wall Street. And they did wire you exactly $5 million this morning. But you were so blinded by your own greed, so completely desperate to secure cash to pay for these white orchids and this vintage champagne, that you made a catastrophic, unforced error. You failed to read the predatory clauses buried in the emergency lending agreement you signed in that glass conference room. Desmond stared at the black leather folder in my hand. His arrogant mask completely shattered, replaced by a look of profound, dawning horror. He began to shake his breath, hitching in his throat as the reality of his blind signature began to surface. I opened the heavy folder and turned directly to the final page. I held the document out toward him, forcing him to look at the dense legal text. I explained to the silent, captivated audience that the contract he signed was not a corporate bridge loan. It was a strictly personal liability agreement. I detailed how the specific clauses he ignored explicitly stated that if his company was found to be under investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for fraudulent activities, the lending firm had the unilateral right to instantly seize total control of his company, liquidate every single one of his personal assets, and hold him entirely criminally liable for the financial deficit. Desmond let out a choked, suffocated gasp. He reached out with trembling fingers, trying to touch the paper, but my elite security guards instantly stepped forward, blocking his path. I kept the document perfectly still. "But that is not even the best part, Desmond," I whispered, speaking directly into the microphone so my voice carried to every corner of the opulent French castle. "I want you to look very closely at the bottom right corner of this final page. I want you to look at the authorization line. The line signed by the executive who approved your $5 million execution order." I raised my manicured finger and tapped sharply on the ink signature, resting directly above the printed title of Chief Executive Officer. "Did you not read the name of the person who authorized your funds, Desmond?" I asked, my tone dropping to a cold, merciless whisper. "I am Caroline. I am the founder and the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. I am the Wall Street titan you just bragged about. I did not wire you a bailout to save your fraudulent company. I bought the exclusive legal right to foreclose on your entire pathetic existence." Desmond stared at the signature. He recognized the elegant, looping handwriting immediately. It was the exact same signature he had seen on the bank statements I had thrown at my father. The final absolute truth crashed down on his narcissistic ego with the force of a falling skyscraper. He realized the cheap accountant he had mocked, the single mother he had tried to humiliate, was the apex predator who now legally owned his entire life. The realization physically broke him. His eyes rolled back and his knees buckled, giving out completely. Desmond collapsed onto the hard marble floor of the stage, landing right at my diamond-clad feet, a broken, ruined man. Desmond remained crumpled on the polished marble floor, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The crushing weight of the $5 million trap I had expertly laid for him finally snapped his arrogant spine. He stared blankly at my diamond heels, his mind desperately searching for a loophole that simply did not exist. Madison stood frozen a few feet away, her extravagant silk gown looking more like a tragic costume than a bridal masterpiece. She stared at the man she thought was her billionaire savior and then shifted her horrified gaze up to me. The golden child was finally processing the reality that the sister she had mocked and degraded her entire life was actually the architect of her absolute destruction. Richard and Patricia were backed against a catered buffet table, clutching each other in pure terror. They had lost their home, their country club status, and their fake high society reputation in a matter of days. Now their last desperate hope for a wealthy son-in-law was melting into a puddle of corporate fraud right in front of them. The wealthy European socialites and venture capitalists who still remained in the ballroom began to murmur loudly. Disgust and outrage rippled through the crowd. They were elite predators themselves, and they despised nothing more than a cheap con artist trying to infiltrate their ranks. Desmond suddenly snapped out of his paralyzed shock. The primal instinct for self-preservation overrode his shattered ego. He scrambled to his feet, his custom Italian suit sliding askew. He looked wildly around the cavernous ballroom, his eyes darting from the angry investors to the towering arched windows. He realized the magnitude of his crimes had caught up to him on foreign soil. He did not say a word to his weeping bride. He did not look back at my terrified parents. He turned on his heel and sprinted in a dead panic toward the Grand Oak exit doors. He knocked over a towering crystal vase of white orchids, sending shattered glass and water exploding across the floor. He shoved past a terrified waiter and bolted for the exit, fully intending to disappear into the Parisian night and evade federal justice. But he had severely underestimated the tactical precision of my operation. As Desmond reached the heavy wooden doors, he slammed his shoulder against them, expecting to burst out into the courtyard. Instead, he bounced off a solid wall of pure muscle. The elite private security agents I had deployed earlier had flawlessly sealed every single exit point in the Chateau de Villette. Two massive former special operatives stepped out of the shadows and blocked the doorway with their arms crossed. Desmond screamed at them to move frantically, pushing against their chests with all his remaining strength. The guards did not even flinch. One of them simply placed a massive hand on Desmond's shoulder and shoved him backward with terrifying ease, sending him stumbling back into the center of the ballroom. Before Desmond could attempt another pathetic escape, the distant wailing sound of heavy sirens pierced the crisp night air. The noise grew rapidly louder, echoing aggressively against the ancient stone walls of the French estate. The distinct, high-pitched blare of European police vehicles sent a fresh wave of panic through my family. Red and blue emergency lights suddenly flashed violently through the floor-to-ceiling glass terraces, illuminating the terrified faces of Madison and my parents in a harsh, rhythmic strobe. The grand oak doors were pushed open from the outside. My private security team respectfully stepped aside, allowing the authorities to breach the perimeter. A tactical unit from the French Economic Police marched into the ballroom, their boots echoing like gunshots against the marble. They were immediately followed by two stern-faced plainclothes agents flashing federal badges. The coordination between the International Financial Crimes Division and American federal authorities was absolute perfection. They did not hesitate or ask questions. They marched in a straight, unbroken line directly toward the center of the room. Desmond backed away, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender, babbling incoherent excuses about a corporate misunderstanding. The lead federal agent stepped forward and cut him off with a voice that commanded total silence. The agent loudly announced Desmond's full legal name and declared that he was being placed under immediate arrest pursuant to an international warrant. The agent projected his voice so every wealthy investor in the room could hear the exact charges. He stated that Desmond was being indicted for a $50 million international securities fraud, aggressive money laundering, and fleeing a federal subpoena. Madison let out an agonizing, hysterical shriek. She lunged forward, trying to grab the arm of the French tactical officer, screaming that they were making a massive mistake and that her fiancé was a legitimate tech billionaire. A female officer firmly grabbed Madison's shoulders and shoved her back, warning her in sharp English to step away or face obstruction charges. Madison collapsed into Patricia's arms, sobbing wildly as her fairy tale fantasy was violently ripped to shreds. The federal agent grabbed Desmond's wrists, forcing his arms behind his back. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked loudly, echoing across the silent ballroom. Desmond did not fight back. He hung his head in absolute defeat, thoroughly humiliated in front of the exact high society elite he had spent months trying to scam. He was handcuffed and completely neutralized right in front of his weeping bride. The aristocratic guests and venture capitalists had seen enough. The illusion was completely shattered, and the stench of federal fraud was too toxic for them to be associated with. In a stunning display of synchronized rejection, the elite guests simultaneously set down their crystal champagne flutes and turned their backs on my family. They grabbed their expensive coats and designer purses, marching out of the ballroom in a massive wave of silent disgust. No one said goodbye. No one offered sympathy. They simply abandoned the sinking ship. The $1 million destination wedding officially crumbled into absolute dust. The opulent ballroom emptied out entirely, leaving behind a sea of half-eaten hors d'oeuvres and discarded luxury. The French police dragged the handcuffed, fraudulent chief executive officer out through the main entrance, the flashing blue lights washing over his ruined face. I stood perfectly still on the grand stage, watching the authorities haul my sister's fake billionaire prince away to a federal holding cell. The trap had closed perfectly, and the devastation was magnificent. The piercing wail of the police sirens slowly faded into the cold Parisian night, leaving behind a suffocating and absolute silence. The grand ballroom of the Chateau de Villette, which just an hour ago was overflowing with elite venture capitalists and European aristocrats, was now a desolate wasteland of shattered illusions. Half-empty crystal champagne flutes rested on abandoned tables. A knocked-over centerpiece of imported white orchids lay crushed against the polished marble floor. The string orchestra had vanished. The wealthy guests had fled the toxic scene of federal fraud as fast as their luxury vehicles could carry them. I remained standing on the elevated stage, looking down at the pathetic remnants of my so-called family. Madison was sprawled on the floor, her extravagant designer wedding gown soaking up spilled wine and dirty water from the broken vases. She was sobbing with loud, violent hiccups, her perfectly contoured makeup running down her face in dark streaks. The billionaire fairy tale she had brutally rubbed in my face for months had literally been dragged away in handcuffs. Patricia and Richard stood paralyzed near the catering buffet, their faces ashen and hollow. They were completely stripped of their fake high society armor, breathing heavily as the reality of their total social and financial annihilation settled over them. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open once again. It was not the authorities returning. It was the austere, sharply dressed estate manager of the chateau, flanked by two massive French security guards. His face was a mask of furious professional disdain. He did not offer a polite greeting. He marched directly toward my parents holding a leather payment folio. He announced in crisp, sharp English that the chateau had just been notified of Desmond's international arrest. Because of the severe disruption, the physical damage to the historic ballroom, and the exorbitant premium services Desmond had recklessly ordered throughout the afternoon, there was an outstanding incidental balance. The manager stated that $20,000 was required to settle the final account. He demanded immediate payment. If the balance was not cleared within the next 5 minutes, he would summon the local gendarmes to arrest them all for defrauding a luxury hospitality establishment. Madison let out a pathetic wail, gripping the tulle of her ruined dress. She shrieked at the manager that her fiancé was a tech mogul, and the corporate card on file would cover everything. The manager looked at her with pure aristocratic disgust. He coldly informed her that Desmond's corporate card had been flagged as a fraudulent instrument and completely frozen by international banking authorities over an hour ago. The card was entirely worthless. Patricia stepped forward, desperately trying to salvage the last microscopic shred of her aristocratic facade. She lifted her chin, attempting to project the haughty confidence she used to terrorize waitstaff at her country club. She let out a fake, nervous laugh, telling the manager it was simply a terrible banking misunderstanding. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her premium platinum credit card. She told him she would happily cover the petty expense to clear up the inconvenience. The manager did not smile. He pulled a mobile payment terminal from his jacket pocket and inserted Patricia's card. The machine processed for exactly 3 seconds before letting out a loud, harsh electronic beep. Declined. Patricia's face dropped. She gasped, snatching the card back and frantically digging into her wallet for another. She handed him a gold travel rewards card. The manager swiped it. The machine beeped again. Declined. Patricia began to shake her breath, coming in short, panicked gasps. She looked at Richard, demanding that he fix the situation immediately. Richard, sweating profusely, pulled out his own heavy metal black card. It was the exact same card I had secretly paid off for years before cutting their financial umbilical cord. He handed it to the manager with a trembling hand. The manager swiped it. A third harsh beep echoed through the empty ballroom. Declined. The estate manager's expression turned to absolute stone. He placed the terminal back into his pocket and signaled his security guards to step closer. He told my parents they had exactly 2 minutes to produce a valid form of currency, or they would be escorted directly into the back of a French police cruiser. The brutal reality finally shattered their delusions. They had absolutely nothing. I had successfully frozen every single account line of credit and emergency fund they possessed. They were standing in a 17th century French castle, thousands of miles away from home, with zero liquid capital and a massive debt they could not pay. Madison began weeping hysterically, screaming that her life was completely over. She rocked back and forth on the marble floor, a broken shell of the arrogant golden child she used to be. Patricia covered her face with her trembling hands, sobbing loudly as the threat of a foreign prison cell loomed over her. Richard looked at the towering security guards and then slowly turned his gaze up toward the grand stage. He looked at me, the arrogant, toxic patriarch who had repeatedly called me a failure, who had evicted me from his life, and who had stolen a massive sum of money from his dying grandson, finally broke. His pride, his ego, and his unearned superiority crumbled into absolute dust. He walked unsteadily toward the stage, his legs shaking under the weight of his total ruin. When he reached the base of the marble steps, he did the one thing I never thought I would witness in my entire lifetime. Richard dropped heavily onto his knees. The loud thud of his bones hitting the hard floor resonated in the quiet room. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his aged face, his hands clasped together in total submission. He begged. He pleaded with me in a broken, pathetic whisper to pay the $20,000 so they would not rot in a foreign jail. He cried openly, asking me to show them mercy. He begged me to just buy them the absolute cheapest economy plane tickets back to New York so they could go home and face their bankruptcy. He swore he would do anything I asked if I just saved them one last time. I stood perfectly still at the very edge of the stage. The brilliant light from the crystal chandeliers reflected off my diamond collar and my emerald gown. I looked down at the weeping, kneeling man who had thrown me away. I looked at my mother sobbing uncontrollably, and my sister writhing in her ruined wedding dress. They were entirely at my mercy, trapped in a hell of their own making. I did not say a word. I simply stood there, looking down at them from the absolute top of the world. I looked down at the pathetic figures cowering at the base of the marble stage. Richard remained on his knees with his head bowed in absolute defeat, his shoulders shaking as he wept openly. Patricia, seeing that her husband's begging had yielded no immediate financial rescue, decided to deploy her oldest, most toxic weapon. She dragged herself up from the cold floor and stumbled toward the steps. She looked up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes, attempting to project the image of a desperate, loving mother. She clasped her hands together against her chest, her knuckles white with tension. "Caroline, please," she whimpered, her voice cracking with practiced theatricality. "You have made your point. You have proven how powerful and successful you are. We are completely humiliated, and we have lost absolutely everything. Is that not enough to satisfy you? We are stranded in a foreign country with no money and no resources. You cannot leave us here to face the French authorities. I carried you for 9 months. I raised you under my roof. Despite all our flaws and our mistakes, we are still your parents. Madison is still your sister. At the end of the day, we are blood. You have to help us because blood means you never abandon your own family." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her words hit me like a physical strike. Blood. She dared to invoke the sanctity of blood to save herself from the consequences of her own horrific greed. I stepped forward, bringing myself right to the very edge of the stage, looming over her trembling form. I looked down at her with an expression devoid of any human sympathy. "Blood," I repeated, my voice dangerously soft yet echoing clearly through the cavernous, empty ballroom. "You want to talk about blood, Patricia? Let us talk about the blood pumping through the defective heart of your 7-year-old grandson. Let us talk about how you walked into a private banking branch, looked a teller dead in the eye, and forged my signature to drain his life support fund. You did not care about blood when you stole $150,000 from a dying child so you could drink vintage champagne and eat white truffles in a French castle. You only cared about your country club status and your fake aristocratic illusion." Patricia flinched violently, taking a step back, as if my words had physically burned her skin. She opened her mouth to formulate another pathetic excuse, shaking her head in frantic denial. It was just a temporary loan, she stammered, her lies unraveling in real time. "We were going to put the money back immediately after the wedding, once Desmond's tech company went public and he gave us the return on our investment. We never meant to hurt little Leo." "Desmond is a convicted international fraudster," I shot back, my voice hardening into solid ice. "And you are exactly like him. You stood in my apartment and told me to stay home and hide my sick son, so I would not embarrass you in front of high society. You called Child Protective Services and tried to have my child taken away by the state because I turned off your luxury credit cards. You did not view me as blood. You viewed me as a disposable automated teller machine. And now that the machine is permanently broken, you suddenly remember we shared DNA. Richard looked up from the floor, his face stained with tears and sweat. His expensive tuxedo was wrinkled and ruined. "We will pay it back, Caroline." He begged, his voice hoarse and broken. "We will do whatever it takes. Just clear this $20,000 bill with the estate manager so we do not go to a European prison. Just buy us cheap economy tickets back to New York. We will work it off. We will spend the rest of our lives making it right. Please do not leave us here." I looked over at the severe French estate manager who was watching the exchange with cold, aristocratic impatience, his security guards standing at the ready. Then I looked back down at the three people who had tortured me, marginalized me, and underestimated me for my entire existence. I reached into my custom emerald evening bag. I did not pull out my heavy metal black card. I did not pull out a platinum checkbook. I reached into the side compartment and pulled out exactly 3 crisp $100 bills. I held the cash out over the edge of the stage. I looked directly into my mother's terrified eyes, and I let my fingers part. The 3 green bills fluttered through the air, drifting down like dead leaves until they landed directly on the polished marble floor, right next to Richard's trembling knees. "There is $300, I announced, my voice ringing with lethal finality. "That is exactly enough for a cheap economy taxi ride from this chateau directly to Charles de Gaulle Airport. As for the $20,000 debt you currently owe this estate manager, I suggest you roll up your sleeves and head straight into the catering kitchen. You can wash dishes, scrub the marble floors, and polish the silver until you pay off every single cent of your pathetic vanity project." Madison let out a blood-curdling scream of pure agony. She lunged forward, tearing at the delicate tulle fabric of her ruined designer wedding dress, wailing that I was an absolute monster. "I am wearing haute couture," she shrieked hysterically. "I cannot wash dishes. I was supposed to be a billionaire wife. You cannot do this to me." Patricia collapsed back onto the hard floor, sobbing uncontrollably and clutching her chest as a full-blown panic attack set in. Richard just stared at the $300 resting on the marble, completely paralyzed by the crushing reality of his total annihilation. I did not stay to watch them break any further. I turned my back on my biological family for the very last time. I walked gracefully across the grand stage, my diamond heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. I descended the side staircase and walked straight past the furious estate manager and his towering security guards. I did not look back. I ignored the agonizing, deafening screams of my mother and sister, echoing off the ancient stone walls behind me. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the crisp, cool Parisian night. The air tasted incredibly sweet and pure. My private security detail immediately flanked me, escorting me down the illuminated gravel path toward my waiting Maybach. The driver quickly opened the heavy reinforced door, and I slid into the luxurious leather interior, smoothing the skirt of my emerald gown. "Take me to the private airstrip," I commanded, staring out the tinted window as the engine purred to life. "We are leaving Paris tonight." The armored vehicle pulled away from the Château de Villette, leaving the burning wreckage of my toxic family far behind in the rearview mirror. I poured myself a single glass of sparkling water from the car's refrigerated minibar and took a slow, satisfying sip. The war was officially over, and I had won absolute, unconditional victory. I was heading back to New York, back to my brave son, back to the massive empire I had built with my own 2 hands, and back to my real beautiful life. Exactly 7 days had passed since I walked out of that 17th century castle and left my toxic family drowning in their own catastrophic debt. I was back in the secure sanctuary of my Manhattan penthouse, breathing the crisp, filtered air of absolute victory. My son Leo was resting comfortably under the watchful eyes of his private medical team, completely oblivious to the international implosion of the grandparents who had tried to steal his life. I sat in my home office, reviewing the latest quarterly reports for Apex Holdings, when my secure phone rang. It was Harrison, my lead corporate attorney, and his voice carried the distinct razor-sharp edge of a predator who had just finished a highly satisfying meal. Harrison informed me that flight number 408 from Paris had just touched down at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Richard, Patricia, and Madison had somehow managed to survive their week of indentured servitude in the chateau kitchens. They had scrubbed marble floors and polished silver until their manicured hands bled, finally earning enough grace from the French authorities to be unceremoniously deported back to the United States on the cheapest economy flight available. But their nightmare was not ending with their arrival on American soil. It was just officially beginning. I opened the encrypted video file Harrison had just sent to my terminal. He had arranged for a private investigator to capture the exact moment my parents stepped into the international arrivals terminal. I watched the high-definition footage as Richard and Patricia shuffled through the sliding glass doors looking utterly broken. Their designer clothes were soiled and wrinkled. They dragged their cheap luggage behind them, their faces pale and sunken from a week of absolute humiliation. They thought they were finally safe. They thought they could just slink back to their suburban mansion and hide from the world. They did not even make it to the baggage claim carousel. The video showed 4 grim-faced federal agents in dark windbreakers stepping directly into Richard and Patricia's path. The agents did not offer polite greetings. They flashed their gold badges and immediately surrounded my parents. I watched closely as the lead agent read them their rights loudly enough for the surrounding crowd of travelers to hear every single word. He stated they were being placed under federal arrest for felony wire fraud, grand larceny, and the malicious embezzlement of a minor's medical trust fund. Patricia dropped her suitcase and completely collapsed, screaming hysterically as an agent pulled her arms behind her back and secured the heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. Richard did not even try to fight. He stood paralyzed, staring blankly ahead as the cold metal clamped down on his own wrists. The man who had spent his entire life obsessing over his flawless high society image was now being publicly walked through a crowded New York airport like a common street criminal. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles waiting outside illuminated their terrified faces. I closed the video file and took a slow, satisfying sip of my espresso. While they were being processed and fingerprinted at the Federal Detention Center, Harrison and I initiated the final phase of their property liquidation. The 30-day eviction notice I had served them at Easter dinner had officially expired. I authorized the county sheriff to execute the final lockout order on their sprawling suburban estate. The local authorities arrived at the property with heavy iron padlocks and bright yellow eviction notices. They sealed every single door and window, officially transferring total physical possession of the mansion back to my real estate holding firm. When Richard and Patricia were finally released on a heavily restricted bail bond late the next evening, they had absolutely nowhere to go. Their credit cards were frozen. Their bank accounts were seized by the federal government pending the fraud investigation. Their country club friends had completely blacklisted them. With no other options, the former high society patriarch and his arrogant wife were forced to drag their remaining garbage bags of clothing to a dilapidated, roach-infested motel on the absolute worst outskirts of the city. They were renting a filthy room by the week, paying with the few crumpled dollar bills they had managed to beg from distant relatives. But the absolute best part of the fallout belonged to my sister Madison. The golden child had managed to avoid federal handcuffs at the airport because she was not technically a signatory on the stolen medical trust. However, the stain of her fraudulent billionaire romance had completely incinerated her entire existence. The international press had ruthlessly covered Desmond's spectacular arrest in Paris. Madison's name and face were splashed across every major financial blog and tabloid as the delusional bride who had aided and abetted a massive $50 million Ponzi scheme. She had lost her fake billionaire husband. She had lost her luxurious lifestyle. And she had entirely lost her employability. Madison desperately tried to secure a job at various upscale public relations firms across the city, hoping to rebuild her shattered image. But corporate recruiters took one look at her background check and immediately threw her resume into the shredder. Nobody wanted to hire a woman globally associated with severe financial crimes and federal fraud. She was completely radioactive. Driven to absolute desperation and entirely out of options, Madison decided to make one final, catastrophically stupid decision. She refused to accept that her reign of arrogance was permanently over. She still believed she could somehow manipulate her way back to the top. My executive assistant buzzed my secure intercom, interrupting my afternoon strategy meeting. Her voice was laced with a mixture of intense alarm and profound amusement. She informed me that a highly aggressive, disheveled woman was currently causing a massive scene in the grand marble lobby of the Apex Holdings Tower on Wall Street. Madison had actually crawled all the way to my corporate fortress, demanding to see the sister she had spent her entire life trying to destroy. I did not panic when my executive assistant frantically buzzed the intercom to inform me of the breach. Madison had somehow managed to bypass the secondary biometric scanners on the ground floor by aggressively tailgating a group of visiting hedge fund managers. She rode the elevator up to the executive suite and was currently standing in the center of the pristine glass-walled bullpen outside my private office. She was weeping loudly and demanding to see her sister. I stood up from my desk and smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit. I walked to the heavy glass door of my office and watched her for a moment before stepping out. Madison looked absolutely unrecognizable. The haughty, arrogant golden child who had flaunted her massive diamond ring at the Oakwood Country Club was completely gone. Her designer clothes were replaced by a wrinkled, oversized sweater and cheap leggings. Her hair was unwashed and pulled into a messy knot. The luxurious aura she had spent her entire life cultivating had evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, pathetic shell of a woman. She was sobbing hysterically, clutching her cheap handbag, while several of my senior financial analysts stared at her in profound discomfort. When Madison saw me open the glass door, she immediately lunged forward. My personal security detail stepped in front of me, instantly blocking her path. She hit the wall of muscle and collapsed onto the polished granite floor. She did not yell or demand respect like she used to. Instead, she dropped her pride entirely and began to beg. It was a repulsive, theatrical display of fabricated victimhood. "Caroline, please, you have to help me," Madison wailed, her voice echoing across the silent executive floor. She reached out toward my leather shoes, her face streaked with running mascara. "I have absolutely nothing left. The media has completely destroyed my life. Every public relations firm in the city has blacklisted me because of Desmond's fraud. I cannot pay my rent, and the bank is threatening to seize my car. You have to give me a job. I will do anything. I will sort the mail. I will fetch coffee for your assistants. I will sweep the floors of this building if you just give me a paycheck. Please, Caroline, we are sisters. You cannot let me starve on the street." I stood perfectly still, letting her pathetic sobs fill the high-ceilinged room. I did not reach out to help her up. I did not offer her a tissue. I looked down at her with an expression of absolute clinical detachment. She was desperately trying to rewrite history, painting herself as an innocent casualty of Desmond's crimes and our parents' greed. She wanted me to forget every single vile word she had ever spoken to me. "You want a job here, Madison?" I asked, my voice cutting through her hysterical crying like a scalpel. "You want to work in my building?" "Yes," she gasped, nodding frantically and looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes. "I will work so hard, Caroline. I promise I will do whatever you tell me. Just give me a chance to prove myself. We are family." "We are. You have to save me." I took a slow, deliberate step closer to her, looking directly into her panicked eyes. "I am going to save you the exact same way you tried to save me," I whispered, my tone dropping to a lethal, icy register. "Let us take a quick trip down memory lane, Madison. Let us revisit the beautiful family dinner we shared just a few weeks ago on Easter Sunday." Madison flinched, visibly shrinking back against the floor. She knew exactly what was coming. "Do you remember what you said to me when I asked about your wedding date?" I continued, my voice rising slightly, so every single executive in the bullpen could hear the absolute truth. You told me that I was a struggling, frumpy single mother who would ruin the aesthetic of your high society, fake billionaire fantasy. You told me to stay home and hide my sick son because a 7-year-old boy with a congenital heart defect would be a massive burden on your luxury vacation. You looked me dead in the eye and called me an embarrassing broke sister who would probably beg your wealthy friends for a handout. Caroline, please, I did not mean it. Madison sobbed, shaking her head wildly. I was just stressed about the wedding. Desmond manipulated me. My parents poisoned my mind against you. It was not my fault. I did not let her deflect the blame. I leaned down slightly, ensuring she felt the full crushing weight of my authority. You laughed when our father told me I was a freeloader living on government assistance, I stated, stripping away her last pathetic defense. You mocked my clothes, and you tried to publicly humiliate me in front of our entire extended family. You gleefully paraded around Paris on money stolen directly from your own nephew's medical trust fund. You are not a victim, Madison. You are a greedy, malicious parasite who finally ran out of hosts to feed on. I straightened my posture and looked down at her with total, unadulterated disgust. I do not hire incompetent people with rotten personalities, I declared, my voice echoing with finality, and I certainly do not hire individuals globally associated with federal wire fraud and international money laundering. You have absolutely nothing of value to offer my firm or my life. Madison opened her mouth to let out another agonizing wail, but I raised my hand and snapped my fingers. The two towering security guards immediately stepped forward, grabbing her firmly by the arms and hauling her off the granite floor. She thrashed against their grip, screaming my name, begging me to reconsider, pleading for mercy. Before they dragged her toward the executive elevators, Harrison stepped out of his adjacent office. My brilliant corporate attorney did not say a single word. He simply walked up to Madison's thrashing form and coldly shoved a thick sealed manila envelope directly into her hands. That is a permanent restraining order signed by a state Supreme Court judge this morning, I announced, watching the absolute terror wash over her face as her fingers clamped around the envelope. You are legally forbidden from coming within 500 feet of me, my son, my residence, or this corporate headquarters. If you ever attempt to contact me or step foot in this building again, you will be arrested and charged with violating a federal protection order. Madison screamed in pure agony, thrashing violently as the security guards dragged her backward into the elevator. I watched the heavy steel doors slide shut, cutting off her hysterical cries and permanently sealing her out of my empire. The blood tie was officially severed. I turned around and walked calmly back into my private office, leaving the toxic remnants of my biological family entirely in the past. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan felt entirely appropriate for the final execution of their fabricated lives. I walked up the wide marble steps flanked by Harrison and my private security detail. I wore a tailored navy blue suit, projecting absolute authority. Inside the grand courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Desmond sat at the first defense table, wearing an orange institutional jumpsuit that contrasted sharply with his previous bespoke Italian suits. At the second defense table, Richard and Patricia looked like hollowed-out ghosts. Their designer wardrobes had been replaced by cheap off-the-rack clothing. They were trembling visibly as I took my seat in the front row, directly behind the federal prosecutors. The judge, a stern man with zero tolerance for white-collar crime, called the session to order. Desmond's case was handled first. The prosecuting attorney laid out the magnificent scale of his fraud, detailing how he had swindled $50 million from naive angel investors to fund a lavish fake billionaire lifestyle. Desmond's defense lawyer tried to argue for a reduced sentence, claiming his client was a misguided entrepreneur who simply got in over his head. Harrison leaned over and handed the prosecutor the emergency loan contract Desmond had signed in my office. The prosecutor presented it to the judge, proving Desmond had actively attempted to defraud a major Wall Street venture capital firm mere hours before flying to Paris. The judge looked at Desmond with absolute disgust. There was no leniency. The gavel slammed down, echoing like a gunshot. Desmond was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Desmond was immediately shackled and led away through a side door. Madison was not even in the gallery to watch her fake prince go to prison. She was likely hiding in some cheap sublet, too humiliated to show her face. Then it was time for Richard and Patricia. The charges were grand larceny, wire fraud, and the malicious embezzlement of a minor's medical trust fund. The prosecutor called me to the witness stand. I walked up the wooden steps, taking the oath with a steady hand and a clear voice. I sat down and looked directly at the two people who had brought me into this world. They could not even meet my gaze. They stared down at their shackled hands, completely crushed by the reality of their public prosecution. The defense attorney, a public defender they were forced to use after their assets were frozen, stood up. He attempted a pitiful strategy, trying to frame the stolen $150,000 as a simple family misunderstanding. He asked me if it was possible my mother genuinely believed she had permission to borrow the funds for a family emergency. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with icy clinical precision. I informed the court that the account was an irrevocable medical trust, explicitly designated for my 7-year-old son's open heart surgery. I presented the physical wire transfer authorization form bearing my forged signature. I detailed how Patricia had walked into a private banking branch and actively lied to a teller, claiming her grandson was in a fatal crisis, just so she could wire the money to a French castle for a wedding party. The public defender opened his mouth to ask another question, but the sheer weight of the financial evidence I provided completely suffocated him. Harrison had compiled a flawless timeline of their extravagant spending, directly linked to the stolen medical funds. The defense attorney looked at the forged signature, looked at his clients, and simply shook his head. He had absolutely nothing left to argue. He quietly returned to his seat, abandoning any further attempt to justify the unjustifiable. The entire courtroom sat in a heavy, stunned silence, absorbing the grotesque reality of a grandmother stealing from her dying grandson. Seeing their legal defense evaporate, Richard and Patricia completely broke down. The judge asked if they had anything to say before sentencing. Patricia stood up, her legs shaking so violently she had to grip the wooden table to stay upright. She began to weep hysterically, abandoning all court decorum. She looked directly at me, tears streaming down her aged face, begging for mercy. She cried out that they were terrified of losing their social standing and made a terrible mistake. Richard stood up next to her, sobbing openly in front of the federal judge. He pleaded with me, claiming they had lost their house, their friends, and their entire dignity. He begged me to tell the judge to spare them from prison, swearing they would spend the rest of their miserable lives making it right. They used the word family over and over again, wielding it like a desperate shield. I sat in the witness stand, completely unmoved by their theatrical grief. I looked at the judge and stated clearly that I requested the maximum financial penalty available under the law. The judge nodded, his expression entirely devoid of sympathy for the two weeping frauds before him. He ordered Richard and Patricia to stand and face the bench. He delivered a scathing reprimand, calling their actions a profound moral failure and a disgusting abuse of familial trust. He struck the wooden block with his gavel and handed down the final judgment. Richard and Patricia were spared immediate federal prison time solely due to their advanced age and lack of prior criminal records, but their punishment was absolute ruin. The judge sentenced them both to 5 years of strict federal probation. They were ordered to perform 2,000 hours of degrading community service, but the most devastating blow was the financial restitution. The court mandated that they repay double the stolen amount. They were legally ordered to pay $300,000 directly back into Leo's medical trust. With their assets frozen and their earning potential completely destroyed by their new status as convicted felons, they would spend the rest of their natural lives working grueling minimum wage jobs just to pay off the debt. They were stripped of their wealth, their honor, and every single social connection they had ever valued. The empire of lies was officially dead, and I walked out of the courtroom completely victorious. 6 months passed since the heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse swung shut on my former family. I sat in the sprawling rooftop garden of my Manhattan penthouse, letting the warm afternoon sunlight wash over my face. The oppressive gray winter had finally surrendered to a brilliant, vibrant spring, and the transformation extended far beyond the changing of the seasons. I rested my hands on the cool wrought iron of my patio table and watched the most magnificent sight of my entire life unfold right in front of me. My son Leo was sprinting across the manicured green lawn of the terrace, chasing after a brightly colored soccer ball. He was not walking carefully. He was not pausing to catch his breath. He was running with the wild, unbridled energy of a perfectly healthy 7-year-old boy. The complex open-heart surgery at Mount Sinai had been an absolute, unmitigated success. The world-class pediatric surgeons I had secured through his medical trust had repaired his congenital defect flawlessly. The haunting rhythmic hissing of the oxygen concentrator that had soundtracked our lives for years was completely gone. It was replaced by the glorious sound of my son laughing loudly as he kicked the ball against the glass railing. I took a slow, deep breath of the crisp city air, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace settle into my bones. The medical trust had done exactly what it was designed to do, and the predators who had tried to drain his lifeline had been permanently eradicated from our universe. The heavy sliding glass door leading to the terrace slid open, interrupting my quiet reflection. Harrison stepped out into the sunlight, wearing his signature immaculate charcoal suit. My brilliant corporate attorney did not look like a man who had spent the last 6 months navigating grueling financial litigation. He looked like a conqueror returning from a highly lucrative war. He walked over to my table and placed a thick, leather-bound financial portfolio directly in front of me. Harrison offered a rare, genuine smile as he took a seat across from me. He informed me that the quarterly reports were officially finalized, and the numbers were completely unprecedented. The aggressive liquidation of Desmond's fraudulent tech company had been completed with absolute surgical precision. Apex Holdings had systematically dismantled Nexus Tech Solutions, selling off their viable assets, hardware infrastructure, and commercial leases to the highest bidders. We had effectively turned a massive federal fraud case into a staggering corporate profit. Harrison tapped the leather portfolio, stating that our venture capital firm had just recorded the single highest growth quarter in its entire operating history. I opened the dossier and scanned the bottom line. The return on investment was astronomical. Desmond's desperate attempt to scam my firm had inadvertently handed me the keys to a highly lucrative corporate salvage operation. He was currently sitting in a maximum security federal penitentiary serving a 15-year sentence, while I was leveraging the ashes of his fake empire to expand my global portfolio. I closed the folder and thanked Harrison for his flawless execution. He simply nodded, acknowledging that betting against me was the single worst financial decision anyone could ever make. After Harrison returned to the corporate headquarters, I picked up my tablet and casually scrolled through the morning financial news. There were articles about market trends, emerging tech startups, and global trade policies. But there was absolutely nothing about the spectacular downfall of Richard and Patricia. The intense media frenzy that had surrounded their airport arrest and public humiliation had completely evaporated. The ruthless 24-hour news cycle had chewed them up, spit them out, and entirely forgotten they ever existed. They were no longer scandalous front-page news. They were just two disgraced aging felons serving out a grueling 5-year probation sentence in absolute obscurity. Through my legal team, I knew they had been forced to take exhausting minimum wage jobs just to make the mandatory monthly payments on their $300,000 court-ordered restitution. The man who used to brag about his golf handicap at the country club was now likely sweeping floors or bagging groceries. The woman who had stolen from her dying grandson to fund a castle wedding was now invisible and destitute. Madison had vanished into the shadows, entirely stripped of her fake billionaire status and completely unemployable in the corporate world. They were trapped in a miserable purgatory of their own design. I set the tablet face down on the table and picked up my porcelain teacup. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my Earl Grey tea, letting the warm, rich flavor ground me in the present moment. I looked out over the sweeping, breathtaking view of the New York City skyline. For 33 years, I had allowed those people to make me feel small. I had endured their toxic criticisms, their relentless gaslighting, and their conditional, twisted version of love. I had believed their narrative that I was a disappointment simply because I refused to conform to their shallow, superficial standards. But as I watched Leo run across the grass, his face flushed with health and pure joy, the final psychological boundary within me completely dissolved. I realized that the ultimate victory was not found in the courtroom. It was not found in watching them cry before a federal judge or seeing them stripped of their fake wealth. The greatest, most devastating revenge I could ever exact upon them was simply living a brilliant, beautiful life that they were permanently forbidden from entering. They had tried to bury me in their shadow, but they only succeeded in forcing me to discover my own absolute power. I was not the victim of their story anymore. I was the architect of my own empire. I had successfully protected my son, secured our financial future, and severed the toxic bloodline that had poisoned my past. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the warm sun on my skin, and smiled. The war was over. I had won everything, and I would never ever look back. The most profound lesson woven through this story is that biology does not automatically earn someone the title of family. True family is defined by unconditional support, respect, and showing up during our absolute darkest moments. For years, Caroline allowed her parents and sister to diminish her worth, accepting their toxic behavior because society conditions us to believe we must endure abuse if it comes from our own blood. But as her journey powerfully illustrates, sharing DNA is never a valid excuse for financial exploitation, psychological manipulation, or sheer cruelty. We often shrink ourselves to fit into the narrow, suffocating boxes our toxic relatives construct for us. Caroline's ultimate triumph was not merely exposing her parents' financial crimes or sending her fraudulent brother-in-law to a federal penitentiary. Her true victory was recognizing her own inherent value and having the absolute courage to establish an impenetrable boundary. She realized that she did not need to prove her worth to people who were entirely committed to misunderstanding her. By severing the financial and emotional ties, she starved their toxic ecosystem and reclaimed her absolute power. Ultimately, the narrative teaches us that the most devastating revenge against those who try to destroy you is not loud, vindictive retaliation. It is absolute, unwavering success combined with clinical detachment. When you permanently remove toxic individuals from your life, you create the necessary space for your true potential to flourish. You owe absolutely nothing to those who view you as a disposable resource for their own selfish gain. Healing begins the exact moment you decide to walk away, protect your peace, and build a beautiful, thriving empire that your abusers are permanently forbidden from entering. If this story of resilience and setting ultimate boundaries resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share your own experiences with toxic family dynamics in the comments below.